To the untrained eye, I looked like the caterer. I didn't pull up to the main entrance of Hargrove Estate. I came through the service gate on Millbrook Road, the one with the rusted latch that nobody had bothered to fix in 30 years, because I knew where it was. I'd known where it was since before the current heir was old enough to hold a fork correctly. I parked my car next to the delivery van, grabbed my clipboard, and walked through the back kitchen like I owned the place, which, in a manner of speaking, I did. Technically, in ways that the new owner hadn't bothered to read about. My name is Lisa. I was the estate manager of Hargrove for 11 years. Not a housekeeper, not a property caretaker. The estate manager, which meant I oversaw the groundskeeping staff, the household staff, coordinated with the family's lawyers, managed the maintenance vendors, tracked the preservation agreements, and generally kept a 1920s Tudor revival mansion from falling apart while the Hargrove family was busy spending money in Manhattan. The patriarch, Edwin Hargrove, had trusted me with every key, every code, every contract since I was 32 years old, and showed up with a master's in historic preservation and a letter of recommendation from the National Trust. Edwin died in March. His son, Brandon, flew in from New York the following Tuesday. I knew Brandon the way you know a recurring bad dream. He'd visited the estate maybe 4 times in the 11 years I worked there. Twice for Christmas, once when his father had a minor health scare, and once to bring a girlfriend who lasted approximately as long as her weekend bag suggested. He was 36, had a finance job he described as basically running things at a firm that had his last name on the letterhead because his father had put it there, and he had the particular brand of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He pulled up in a rented Tesla that cost more per day than most of my staff made in a week. I was in the rose garden when I heard the tires on the gravel. I didn't rush. I finished marking the maintenance log, tucked my pen behind my ear, and walked around to the front drive at a pace I would describe as deliberately unhurried. "You," he said, pointing at me from across the hood of the car. "Where can I park this?" I looked at him. I looked at the circular drive with approximately 400 square feet of clearly available parking space directly in front of him. "Anywhere on the drive is fine," I said. He looked at me the way people look at GPS when it says something they don't want to hear. Then he pulled forward, did a sharp turn, and drove the Tesla directly over the corner of the east lawn. I want to be precise about what that lawn was. That was not a lawn in the sense that your neighbor's lawn is a lawn. That was a continuous stretch of Kentucky bluegrass that had been tended, aerated, overseeded, and maintained according to a specific regimen developed by the same landscaping family for going on 40 years. There was a hand-drawn maintenance document in the estate files. Edwin had consulted with a turf specialist from the University Extension program every spring. The grass was, I'm not exaggerating, historically documented in the estate's preservation file as part of the original landscape design. And Brandon drove a Tesla over it because he didn't want to back up 6 feet. I watched 2 deep ruts open up in the ground. I took a breath. I said nothing. He got out of the car and looked at me again, this time with the look people give service workers when they want acknowledgement without interaction. "I'll need the house keys and a full staff rundown by end of day," he said, "and somebody needs to fix those tire marks." Of course, I said. That was the first day. The second day, Brandon toured the house. I walked him through all 18 rooms, which took about 2 hours, during which time he made a sound like a slow leak whenever he saw something he didn't like. The portrait gallery, the sound. The Tudor-style beamed ceilings in the great hall, the sound. The butler's pantry with its original glass-fronted cabinetry, a longer sound, almost musical in how sustained it was. This whole place needs to be gutted, he said, standing in the center of the library. The library was the reason I had taken this job. I want you to understand that I had turned down 2 other positions in 2013 because neither of them had a library like the Hargrove Library. Floor-to-ceiling built-in shelving and American chestnut installed in 1924 by a craftsman whose name was still written in pencil on the back of the door panel if you knew where to look. A rolling ladder on a brass rail, 3 wingback chairs that had been reupholstered once in 1987 in the same fabric pattern as the original. A fireplace with a hand-carved mantel, and books, actual books, thousands of them. Some of them first editions, all of them cataloged in a leather-bound register that Edwin had maintained himself until his hands got bad. Gut it how? I asked. All of this. He gestured at the shelving like he was swatting a fly. Take it out. Put in a home theater, a proper one, with a projector and the recliner seating, the whole thing. I've got a guy in the city who does these. The chestnut millwork is original, I said. It was installed in... I know what it is, he said, which was a lie so transparent it almost had a shine to it. I just don't care. Who reads anymore? He was looking at his phone when he said it. I remember that specifically. He was looking at his phone, asking a rhetorical question about reading, standing inside 1,100 square feet of curated human thought. I made a note. The third day, Brandon met with the groundskeeper, a man named Gerald who had worked the estate for 22 years and had the kind of quiet dignity that made Brandon visibly uncomfortable. Gerald explained the spring aeration schedule, the irrigation system, the specific fertilization protocol for the heritage rose beds along the south wall. Brandon told him to skip all of it and just keep things looking neat. Then he told Gerald to pull out the rose beds. Those roses had been planted by Edwin's mother in 1962. They were documented in the County Historical Society's record of the property. There were photographs of them in the estate's submission to the State Historic Register. They were, in the formal language of that registration, a contributing landscape feature to the property's historical integrity. Gerald looked at me. I looked at Gerald. Neither of us said anything because sometimes the most important thing you can say is nothing and you let the other person believe they've won. That evening, I went home and opened my copy of the Hargrove Estate Trust documents. I had read them before, obviously. Edwin had walked me through the relevant sections when I first started. He was a meticulous man, Edwin. He had a particular belief, which he expressed to me once over coffee in the kitchen while a January ice storm made the windows sound like they were being slowly applauded, that institutions outlasted individuals, and that the job of any individual responsible for an institution was to make sure the next person couldn't ruin it through carelessness. He had built that belief into the trust. Section 9, subsection C, the Hargrove Estate Trust Preservation Covenant. Any primary beneficiary taking possession of the estate property was required, as a condition of maintaining full inheritance rights to both the property and the accompanying financial assets, to maintain the estate in accordance with its existing historic register designation. Modifications to documented historic fabric, architectural, landscape, or otherwise, required written approval from the Hargrove Estate Preservation Committee. The committee had 2 permanent members: the family attorney, a methodical woman named Patricia Chin, who had been Edwin's lawyer for over 2 decades, and who I knew for a fact kept a printed copy of every document she'd ever touched, organized by year in fireproof boxes, and the estate manager, which was me. I sat with that for a minute, just a minute. Then I made a cup of tea, sat down at my kitchen table, and started making a list. The rose beds, the library millwork, the lawn. 3 documented violations of the preservation covenant in 4 days. And Brandon hadn't even gotten to the ballroom yet. The Hargrove Ballroom was the architectural centerpiece of the estate. Original 1922 construction with a sprung maple floor. The kind of floor that has a slight flex built into it, designed for dancing, which nobody does anymore. But the floor doesn't know that. Crown molding that had been painstakingly restored in 1998 at Edwin's personal expense. A pair of French doors that opened onto the south terrace and were made from a wood species that was, I am being literal here, no longer commercially available. The doors alone were irreplaceable. An appraiser had told Edwin as much in 2015. Brandon had a design firm coming in the following Thursday. I found out because he had copied me on the calendar invite without reading the invite carefully enough to realize he'd copied me. The subject line said, Hargrove Ballroom Renovation Consult, converting to entertainment suite with bar. I forwarded the invite to Patricia Chin with 3 words. Subsection 9C applies. Patricia called me 17 minutes later. Does he know? She asked. No, I said. He hasn't read the trust. There was a pause. Patricia was not a dramatic person. She was the opposite of dramatic. She was the kind of person who said, I see, when what she meant was, this is extraordinary, because she had trained herself out of any reaction that wasn't billable. I'll need documentation of the violations, she said. I have photographs of the lawn damage from day 1, I said. I have his verbal instruction to Gerald regarding the rose beds, and Gerald is willing to provide a written statement. I have his directive to me regarding the library millwork, which I have summarized in a memo I sent to myself by email that same evening with a timestamp. Another pause. You anticipated this, she said. I've managed this estate for 11 years, I said. I anticipated a lot of things. I want to be honest about something. This next part wasn't easy. There's a version of this story where I felt triumphant from the beginning, where I was cool and calculated and certain the whole time. That's not true. The night before Patricia sent the formal notice, I sat in my car in my driveway for about 20 minutes doing nothing, because 11 years is a long time. Because I had loved that job in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has never loved a place the way you can love a place. The specific smell of the library in winter, the way the morning light came through the east windows in the breakfast room, the sound the gravel made under your feet when everything else was quiet. I had loved that place, and I had just quietly set in motion something that was going to create a significant legal and financial problem for the man who now owned it. I wasn't sure I felt good about it. Then I remembered the rose beds, the ones his grandmother planted in 1962. The ones she had tended herself until she couldn't kneel anymore, and then she'd hired someone to kneel for her so she could still direct. The ones that had been there for 62 years and survived 2 recessions, a roof replacement, and a family that had moved to New York and rarely visited, survived all of that and were going to be pulled out by a man who described himself as basically running things and couldn't be bothered to back his rental car out of the way. I started the car and drove home. Patricia sent the notice on a Wednesday morning. It was formal, precise, and approximately 4 pages long, which is the legal equivalent of a very controlled explosion. It outlined the 3 documented violations of the Preservation Covenant, cited the relevant sections of the trust, and informed Brandon that under the terms of Section 9, subsection F, continued violations pending committee review could constitute grounds for a challenge to the inheritance distribution. In plain language, keep breaking the rules and the estate lawyers have cause to revisit who gets what. I know what happened next because Gerald told me, and because the property management camera system, which I had installed, maintained, and still had access to as active estate manager, covered the front entrance. Brandon's phone rang at 11:47 that morning. He was standing on the front steps, talking to someone on another call when he saw Patricia's email notification. He ended the first call. He read the email. He stood very still for what I counted as 23 seconds, which is a long time to stand very still when you're outside. Then he looked around, the way people do when they sense they're being watched but can't identify where the watching is coming from. He called me 8 minutes later. "What did you do?" he said. I was in my car, parked on the far side of the property near the service gate, because I had been expecting this call and I had wanted to take it somewhere quiet. I fulfilled my responsibilities as a member of the Preservation Committee, I said, which are outlined in the trust documents you received when you assumed the estate. He started, stopped, started again. "You can't do this. I own this property." "You own the property subject to the covenant conditions," I said, which is standard for estates with historic register designations. Your father was very clear about the terms when the trust was established. Patricia was present for all of those conversations. "Patricia works for this estate," he said. "I'll have her replaced." "Patricia's role is also defined in the trust," I said. "She serves as independent legal counsel to the Preservation Committee for a term that doesn't expire for another 6 years. You're welcome to consult a separate attorney if you'd like a second opinion." Silence. Long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "What do I have to do?" he said finally, and his voice had changed. Not humbled exactly. Brandon didn't do humble. But the particular texture of entitlement had shifted into something more like calculation. He was trying to find the angle. "The covenant requires you to restore any modifications made to documented historic fabric within 90 days, I said. "The lawn will need to be resodded according to the existing maintenance protocol. The rose beds need to remain. No further modifications to any documented architectural or landscape features without committee approval. You're welcome to submit modification requests for the library, the ballroom, anything else, and the committee will review them." "And who's on this committee?" he said. "Patricia Chin and the estate manager." "You," he said. "Currently, yes." Another silence. "I fired you," he said. "You did," I said. "However, the estate manager position, as defined in the trust, has a structured notice period and transition process that requires committee approval to finalize. Since the committee is currently in an active review period regarding the covenant violations, my employment status is considered pending resolution. I paused. Your father was very thorough. I could hear him breathing, that particular kind of breathing that happens when someone realizes they are standing in a room with no visible exits and they have not yet figured out that they put themselves there. This is insane, he said. It's a legal document, I said. It's quite sane. It just requires reading. The design firm consult was canceled. Gerald's rose bed stayed. A landscape contractor came out 2 weeks later to re-sod the east lawn. I supervised the work personally because that's what I do, and because I wanted to make sure they matched the existing bluegrass strain correctly. They did. You can still see the seam lines if you know where to look, but they'll grow out by fall. Brandon spent 6 weeks working with Patricia's office on a modification request for one of the guest bathrooms. A full renovation, no historic fabric involved, no documented features affected. The committee approved it in 11 days. I even sent him a note through Patricia's office suggesting a tile contractor I'd worked with before, one who did excellent work at a reasonable price and who wouldn't charge him New York rates for New Jersey work. Well, he didn't use the contractor, but he kept the note. I know because I saw it on his desk when I walked through the house in April for the quarterly inspection. It was under a legal pad, slightly crumpled, but kept. People are complicated, even the ones who drive over century-old grass because they can't be bothered to back up 6 feet. Even the ones who look at a library full of irreplaceable books and say, "Who reads anymore?" while holding a phone that contains every word ever written. They're still complicated. They still keep notes sometimes. I don't know what Brandon will do with that estate in the long run. I know what the covenant requires him to do, and I know Patricia will make sure it's enforced, and I know that the preservation committee, which still includes me because the transition process requires committee approval, and the committee has not approved it, will keep reviewing every modification request with exactly the attention it deserves. The library is still the library. The rose beds are blooming. Early this year. Gerald says it's the mild winter. Edwin planted a Cecil Brunner along the east fence the year his wife died. A climber, the old-fashioned kind. Tiny pale pink blooms in clusters. It takes years to establish properly. He planted it anyway because he was the kind of person who thought that way. Not about what he would see, but about what would still be thereafter. I walked past it this morning on my way to the service gate. It's doing fine. People ask me sometimes if I regret how it played out, if I wish I'd confronted Brandon directly, told him what I knew up front, given him a chance to course correct before I brought in Patricia and the covenant and the full legal weight of what his father had built. I've thought about that, genuinely thought about it, not just as a way to feel better about my choices. Here's what I keep coming back to. Brandon had every chance to ask. He had the trust documents. He had my contact information. He had Gerald, who had worked that land for 22 years and knew every inch of it. He had Patricia's number in the paperwork he signed when he assumed the estate. He had all of it, and he chose not to read any of it because he had spent his entire life in rooms where the details were handled by other people and the consequences never quite reached him. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern, and patterns have weight. I'm not talking about punishment in any cosmic sense. I'm talking about something more practical and, honestly, more uncomfortable than that. The idea that what you repeatedly choose to ignore will eventually become what you cannot avoid. Brandon ignored the documents. He ignored Gerald's expertise. He ignored 11 years of institutional knowledge I was offering him for free. Every single day, I kept showing up to that estate. He treated all of it like furniture he hadn't decided whether to keep yet. And eventually, the thing he'd been ignoring was the only thing left in the room. That's cause and effect. Not fate, not justice handed down from anywhere, just the very ordinary consequence of choosing convenience over competence repeatedly until the bill comes due. What I learned, and I mean learned in the way that actually changes how you move through the world, not just something you say, is that expertise is invisible until it's needed. For 11 years, I knew about that preservation covenant. I knew about Patricia's role, the committee structure, the 90-day restoration requirements. I knew it the way you know the location of the fire extinguisher in a building you've worked in for a decade. You don't think about it, you just know. And the knowing sits there quiet and patient until the moment it becomes the only thing that matters. That's what diligence actually looks like, I think. Not drama, not visible effort, just the accumulation of knowledge and attention over time, maintained even when nobody is watching, even when the person you work for is 3 states away and wouldn't notice if you cut corners. Edwin noticed. Edwin always noticed. And when he couldn't notice anymore, he built a structure that would notice for him. I think about that a lot, about the kind of person who thinks that carefully about what happens after they're gone. Who plants a climbing rose knowing they might not live to see it bloom the way they imagined? Who writes a legal covenant not out of distrust of his son, but out of love for something larger than any one person's preferences? That's the thing Brandon couldn't understand, and maybe still doesn't. The estate was never just property. It was a set of choices made by people who thought past themselves. Choosing to protect it wasn't revenge. It was just the continuation of those choices made by someone who had been paying attention long enough to know what they meant. The rose beds are fine. The library is fine. I'm still the estate manager, technically, pending committee approval of my termination. The committee hasn't approved it yet.